Hello and welcome. My name is Melissa Galasso, and I'm excited to talk to you today about FASB's most recent accounting standards update, ASU 2021-03. Now, this standard was issued in March 2021. FASB promised the standard by the end of the quarter, and they got it in by the skin of their teeth on March 30th. This is a much awaited standard. It really has been in conversation since back in September of 2020. So let's talk a little bit about where this issue came from and how we got to where we are today. So the AICPA has a committee called the Technical Issues Committee. I have had the honor of serving on the committee in the past. I have since rolled off, but it is probably one of my favorite committees at the AICPA to work on. And they provide feedback to standard setters on their exposure drafts. So we responded to FASB, AICPA, and GASB comment letter or exposure drafts by writing comment letters on behalf of the Technical Issues Committee. And it's a great opportunity. In addition, the committee meets regularly with standard setters. So they have calls and meetings with FASB and GASB and the Auditing Standards Board and ARSC to talk about what's going on from a standard setting perspective. And in September of 2020, the AICPA's Technical Issues Committee had a meeting with FASB. Now, normally that meeting would have taken place in Norwalk, Connecticut, but due to COVID, it was a virtual meeting. And during that presentation, one of the members of the Technical Issues Committee presented an issue that they felt very strongly needed to be addressed in GAAP, and that was goodwill and triggering events. So what is the issue here? Well, with COVID-19, a lot of entities obviously would have to consider whether they had a triggering event given what happened in the economy, right? Nationwide closures, work from home, stay at home orders, as well as just, complete drop in interest rates, et cetera. So clearly something in the economy happened. And when we look at it from this perspective, an entity is required to monitor and evaluate goodwill impairment triggering events throughout the reporting period. So even if you are a private entity, you're required to consider whether at any point during your year you had a triggering event. And the example that was used by the AICPA's Technical Issues Committee is a company called Del Taco. For those of you who are not familiar with Del Taco, it is a fast food chain. I found it on the West Coast. We went for spring break out to Tahoe for some skiing, and there is a Del Taco in that area. So I was able to go and see it. I actually sought it out to get a photo of it so that I could say that I had seen and been to a Del Taco. For those of you who haven't, it is probably going to not love me, but I'm going to say it's just like a Taco Bell for us East Coasters who don't have Del Tacos out here. And so when we are looking at this, they brought up this example. And obviously, if you think about this, a lot of those West Coast states were early hit by COVID. They were some of the earliest cases in the United States and immediately saw these stay-at-home orders come into play. So a lot of times they were closing restaurants and they were closing various stores and restaurants, et cetera, due to the virus. And in that scenario, it made sense that by March 31st, right, when they created their, Del Taco is publicly traded. So when they were issuing their Q for the March 31st year end, they obviously determined that they had a triggering event in their first quarter, obviously given the impact of COVID-19 and their closures. As a result, they identified the triggering event, and in fact, they wrote off a massive amount of their goodwill due to that triggering event. However, if we were to keep following the Del Taco story, what we would find is, like many states, eventually we started to reopen slowly, whether that was doing takeout only, whether that was delivery. We started to see recovery. And for entities, we started bringing people back into the office. Maybe you couldn't eat inside, but you could still use that takeout window. And so they started to actually see an uptick in sales because a lot of the sit-down restaurants were closed or at a very small capacity. So California, you still couldn't eat inside of a restaurant when we were there for spring break. In Nevada, we could. So we stayed in Nevada and we skied in California. And we were eating in the Nevada side so that we could sit down in a restaurant, given that we were tourists and had no real alternative. So we would, obviously have to eat somewhere. And so we were going to the restaurants in Nevada who were at 30% capacity. So still not completely full, but still had an opportunity for us to eat dinner. And so when we were looking at this, they started to rebound and they started to be able to sell again. And then by the end of the year, so when they were having this meeting, it was September, 6 months later, they had started to see a rebound in their sales. They started to see a rebound across the board. And so as you can imagine, Del Taco would have loved to have waited to the end of their fiscal year to see that rebound. However, there's a catch. Because when you look at the requirements for goodwill impairment, once you identify a triggering event, you are not allowed to use known changes to facts and circumstances after that triggering event or hindsight. So if we had continued to December, Del Taco still would have had to identify that there was a triggering event in March and done a goodwill assessment as of the information available in March, regardless of what they knew happened since then. Well, for public companies, it makes sense. They have queues, and so they have to do this quarterly finding and filings, and so as a result, it made sense to require them to go through this process. For private companies, on the other hand, who have these longer fiscal years and don't typically file quarterly financial statements, to go and tell a business owner in December that has fully recovered from COVID, is operating, is doing great from that perspective, one of the things that people sort of questioned was, why would I have to go back and pretend that we didn't have this recovery? And that was the story that was brought to FASB. And given the volume of entities, private companies who would be impacted by this, obviously FASB took them up on this conversation. So who is going to be impacted here? Predominantly private companies and not-for-profit entities. Public companies are not permitted to use this new standard. So what is our update here? Well, you can now perform goodwill impairment triggering events as of the end of your reporting period, whether that's an interim period or an annual period. So you can now, you don't have to look throughout the year. You can just look at that period. So if you only file annual financial statements at the end of the year, you would look to see if you have a triggering event. You would not have to look throughout the year and ignore that recovery. So if as of December, you don't have a triggering event anymore and you have recovered, you would no longer have to do that goodwill impairment test. So you're not required to monitor for goodwill impairment throughout the period, but instead you would evaluate facts and circumstances at the end of each reporting period to determine whether a triggering event exists at that point, and if so, whether it's more likely than not that goodwill is impaired. So this is a huge win for private entities, especially dealing with COVID. Should reduce the number of goodwill impairment tests that entities need to consider as we go through this. Now, some entities haven't recovered, so we're not saying this is like this great response in terms of, we're just going to assume that no one has a triggering event. There are industries that are still definitely negatively impacted and may have a triggering event at their year end. It's just not requiring them to ignore that hindsight and the evaluation, and it might not be as bad, perhaps. It could be worse. Who knows? A lot of industries were impacted differently, so there's not a one-size-fits-all. So when is this effective? Well, while it wasn't issued until March of 2021, they did give a retroactive effective date because they were intentionally trying to target those COVID items. So it is effective for fiscal years beginning after December 15, 2019. It is prospective treatment. However, early adoption is permitted for interim and annual financial statements that have not yet been issued or made available for issuance as of March 30th, which is the date that they issued the standard. So again, they were trying to make this very user-friendly. You are not allowed to restate retroactively anything that had already been issued. So for many firms, we've been talking about this standard coming down the pike, and we're like, don't issue if you think you can overcome this for those December year ends. Wait for this standard to come out. In terms of an opt-in, maybe you don't have any triggering events right now and you don't have to adopt this standard. It does include an unconditional one-time option to adopt the alternative prospectively anytime in the future without having to assess preferability, consistent with a lot of what we see for these private entities. All right, so as I mentioned, much awaited standard. We were really excited to have this issued. Hopefully it will reduce cost and complexity for many nonprofits and private entities. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in a future class. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.